In January 1964, a 17-year-old boy in San Diego made a bet with two friends. He would not sleep for 11 days. He would break the world record. He would prove it could be done. His name was Randy Gardner. He was a high school student. He had a science fair project to submit and a record to beat, and absolutely no idea what he was about to do to his brain. By day 3, he was seeing things that weren't there. By day 4, he believed he was someone else entirely. By day 11, he stood in front of a room full of journalists and spoke in complete sentences and answered every question they asked. And the most terrifying thing about that press conference was how normal he seemed. Word reached William Dement 3 days before the experiment ended. Dement was a sleep researcher at Stanford University, one of the few people in the world who had spent his career studying what sleep actually does and what happens when it stops. He drove to San Diego with monitoring equipment and introduced himself to a teenager who had not slept in 8 days. What he observed over those final 72 hours would change how science understood sleep deprivation entirely. But to understand what Dement found at day 11, you have to go back to day 3. Days 1 and 2 were unremarkable. Gardner was tired. Irritable, he needed his friends to keep him awake, to tap his shoulder when his eyes began to close. He played basketball. He watched television. Nothing about him, from the outside, suggested that anything serious had begun. Then came day 3. And here is where it gets strange. Gardner was standing on a street corner when he looked at a street sign and saw a person standing where the sign had been. Not a flicker, not a trick of the light. A person standing still who was not there. He blinked and it resolved back into a sign. He told his friends. They noted it. They kept going. What none of them understood yet was that the hallucination wasn't a symptom of extreme deprivation. At roughly 72 hours without sleep, the human brain begins to produce REM-like intrusions into waking consciousness fragments of dreaming pushed into an awake mind that can no longer maintain the boundary between the two states. Day 3 was not a warning sign. Day 3 was the beginning of something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with tiredness. Day 4, Gardner became convinced, briefly but completely, that he was a famous black football player. He was a white teenager from San Diego. When his friends tried to correct him, he argued. The belief held. It had its own internal logic, its own certainty. Then it dissolved, and he was Randy Gardner again, with no clear memory of it afterward. Day 5, irritability so severe that Dement began editing his questions, avoiding subjects that triggered responses he couldn't de-escalate. Day 6, Gardner began losing sentences midway through. He would start a thought and arrive, a few words later, somewhere the thought had simply gone. He finished them anyway with whatever words arrived next. Day 9, his eyes stopped tracking together. Held up an object, he could not identify it by touch alone. The connections between sensation and recognition were fraying in ways that had no visible surface. Day 11, Randy Gardner walked into a press conference. He sat down. He answered questions. He was coherent, occasionally funny, present in the way a tired person is present. The journalists noted he seemed remarkably composed for someone who hadn't slept in 11 days. What Dement's equipment showed was something else entirely. Gardner's brain, by that point, was essentially switching off in sections microsleeps, lasting fractions of a second, firing in individual regions while other regions stayed nominally awake. The press conference wasn't proof that he had held it together. It was proof that the human brain, even in catastrophic failure, will produce a performance of normalcy until the last possible moment. The most dangerous thing about day 11 was how much it looked like day 1. But here is the third thing. The thing the day stamps don't quite capture. Sleep is not simply rest. It is one of the mechanisms that keeps the self coherent, not metaphorically literally. The consolidation that happens during sleep is not just memory, it is the continuous process of integrating experience into a stable sense of who you are. Remove it long enough and that integration stops. The boundaries of identity begin to loosen. Day 4 wasn't a delusion Gardner chose. It was what happens when the brain loses the thread that connects moment to moment, experience to experience, self to self. He didn't lose his mind. His mind lost its architecture. And the terrifying implication, the one that applies beyond the extreme case of 11 days, is that this integration is happening every night, quietly, in every sleeping brain, which means the version of you that wakes up tomorrow is partly built by what happens to your brain in the next 8 hours, or doesn't happen. After the press conference, Randy Gardner slept for 14 hours and 40 minutes. He woke feeling fine. Recovered back, Dement's measurements told a completely different story. The cognitive debt Gardner had accumulated across 11 days was not repaid in 14 hours. The feeling of recovery and the fact of recovery were not the same thing. His brain told him he was fine. His brain was wrong. This is the part that was quietly filed away and mostly forgotten. Here is the part that wasn't. Guinness World Records eventually removed the category of longest time without sleep from their records. Not because the record had been broken too often, because the attempt itself was deemed too dangerous to encourage. They draw that line rarely. The record Randy Gardner set in 1964 still stands. Not because nobody has tried. Because the organization that tracks world records decided this particular limit should not be a competition. Now here is where you are in this. And this is the part that should concern you most. You are not Randy Gardner. You are not attempting a record. You are sleeping some amount, most nights, enough to function. Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley found something that should be more widely known. People who sleep 6 hours a night consistently rate their own alertness, their cognitive performance, their capacity as normal, as fine. The objective measurements tell a different story. After 2 weeks of 6-hour nights, cognitive impairment accumulates to the equivalent of 24 hours without sleep. The performance matches someone who hasn't slept at all, and they cannot feel it. The gap between what the body is doing and what the mind reports is not a minor discrepancy. It is the difference between someone who knows they are impaired and someone who has no idea the compensation is even needed. This is what Dement observed at the press conference. The brain, when sufficiently compromised, loses the ability to assess its own compromise. The instrument that would tell you something is wrong is the same instrument that is broken. Sleep deprivation hides inside your own confidence. Randy Gardner is in his 70s now. For decades after the experiment, he gave almost no interviews. He got on with his life. He became a person who had done a thing once at 17 and then moved past it. In 2017, he finally spoke about it at length. A journalist asked him what he remembered most clearly. He said it wasn't the hallucinations or the record. It was that through all of it, he had genuinely believed he was fine. The damage was real. The record stands. The category no longer exists. And the most dangerous thing sleep deprivation does isn't what you feel, it's what you can't.